Crimson Inquiry.
A perplexing crime in Whitechapel. The night had descended over Whitechapel like a thick, suffocating shroud, and the gas lamps cast quivering shadows upon the narrow, rain-slicked streets. Dr. John Watson, ever faithful and observant, followed Sherlock Holmes along the fog-bound alleys, noting how the detective's keen eyes seemed to pierce through the gloom. "This case, Watson," Holmes said in a low, precise voice, "is unlike any we have encountered. The newspapers call it supernatural nonsense. Yet I assure you, the solution is strictly terrestrial, though exceedingly clever." Watson shivered, more from the uneasy chill of the London night than from any fear of the supernatural. They had been summoned to a scene where a prominent merchant had been discovered in his private chambers, apparently drained of blood. The household staff, hysterical and incoherent, insisted upon some vampiric influence, citing puncture marks upon the victim's neck and the absence of any forced entry. Holmes crouched beside the body, examining the victim's face and the subtle discolorations around the throat. "Notice, Watson, the absence of struggle, the precise nature of the punctures, and the singular positioning of the victim's body. This is no random attack. It is deliberate, and yet intentionally misleading." The Scotland Yard inspectors present, men of solid reputation and no small degree of pride, exchanged uneasy glances. "We cannot fathom how anyone could have entered," one muttered, "nor why he should be the target of such a ghastly act." Holmes straightened, brushing the rain from his coat, and surveyed the room with the intensity of a hawk. "Ah, but you see, gentlemen, the apparent impossibility is often a signpost to the true method. And in that impossibility, the clever criminal reveals the depth of his cunning." Watson, scribbling furiously in his notebook, attempted to digest Holmes' words. The detective's calm confidence contrasted sharply with the panic and superstition surrounding them. Even in a district long accustomed to grisly murders, the notion of a vampire had unsettled the household, and by extension, much of Whitechapel itself. Holmes' gaze drifted to the window, then back to the furniture, the carpet, and the faint smudges on the floorboards. "Every detail tells a story, Watson. Even the shadows whisper secrets if one has the patience to listen." Little did Watson know that within the next hours, they would encounter a series of clues, red herrings, and ingenious deceptions that would confound even the most disciplined minds of Scotland Yard. And yet, Holmes' singular brilliance promised a resolution that would expose the truth behind what the fearful had already labeled the work of a vampire. The night deepened, and in that fog-bound chamber of dread, a mystery both chilling and intellectually exquisite had begun, a puzzle that only Sherlock Holmes could unravel. The morning sun struggled to pierce the dense London fog as Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, our minds preoccupied with the perplexing events of the previous night. Holmes, uncharacteristically silent, paced the room with long, measured strides, each step seeming to echo the gears turning relentlessly behind his sharp, analytical eyes. I settled into my chair by the hearth, nursing a cup of tepid tea, and attempted to make sense of what we had witnessed. Yet, every time I formulated a theory, Holmes' inscrutable expression suggested I was missing something crucial. Holmes finally spoke, breaking the tense silence. "Watson, the superficial elements of the crime are intentionally theatrical. The puncture marks, the absence of a struggle, the locked chamber, each is a deliberate misdirection." He paused, peering out the window at the swirling fog over Whitechapel. "A man's mind is far more malleable than we often admit. Fear is a tool, and our unknown adversary wields it with precision." I scribbled his words, striving to keep pace with the torrent of ideas rushing through my own mind. "But how, Holmes?" "The windows were locked, the doors bolted from the inside. The servants swear no one entered or left. It defies every notion of conventional crime." "Precisely, Watson," he replied, his eyes lighting with a gleam of satisfaction. The impossible is rarely impossible. Often, it is simply misunderstood. And the mind that orchestrates it is equally careful to obscure each step, leaving only the illusion of the supernatural. He strode over to his table, picking up a scrap of paper and holding it between his slender fingers. Observe, Watson. Even the smallest detail, a misplaced article, a shadow that does not belong, can unravel the entire scheme. I leaned forward, eager for any insight. Then our first step is to examine the scene meticulously once more, yes? Holmes inclined his head. Indeed. We shall retrace the steps of our so-called vampire. But more importantly, we shall consider what is absent, rather than what is present. The criminal's genius lies in creating a pattern that appears complete, while leaving the critical thread invisible to the untrained eye. We set out once more toward Whitechapel, the streets still damp and uneven underfoot, and the fog wrapping around us like a shroud. Holmes' eyes scanned the buildings as though he could read their very structure, noting angles, heights, and doorways that an ordinary observer would ignore. The silence between us was comfortable, yet charged with anticipation. I had learned that any comment I made too early often interrupted the delicate process of his deduction. Upon reaching the merchant's residence, Holmes gestured to the door. Notice the lock, Watson. On first glance, it appears undisturbed. But consider the mechanism. The latch leaves a microscopic trace when manipulated. One who knows this building intimately could exploit it without leaving a sign. Mark my words, the perpetrator has been here before. Inside, the room retained the eerie stillness of the previous night, though the morning light softened its oppressive quality. Holmes crouched beside the body once again, inspecting every detail. His eyes traveled from the victim's neck to the drapery, the carpet, and even the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. I recorded his observations dutifully, though many seemed insignificant to me. A faint scuff near the window, a slight indentation on the rug, the way a candlestick had been positioned at an almost imperceptible angle. Holmes straightened abruptly, producing a small magnifying glass from his coat. Here, Watson. Observe these marks on the floorboards. One might dismiss them as trivial, yet they are the first clue that the scene has been staged. The criminal seeks to guide our attention deliberately away from the true method. I leaned in, struggling to see what he saw. They appear random, I said hesitantly. Ah, but randomness is the favorite cloak of the clever, Holmes replied. Notice the spacing, the orientation. It is too regular to be incidental, yet not so obvious as to alert the casual observer. Our adversary wants us to feel helpless, to imagine the intervention of forces beyond comprehension. Holmes' mind, I realized, was already several steps ahead, threading connections invisible to ordinary eyes. He moved to the desk, rifling through papers with swift, precise motions, and extracted a folded letter, yellowed at the edges. This, he said, holding it delicately, is what the average person would overlook. Note the ink, Watson, the kind used in a particular stationery house in Holborn. Such a trivial detail, yet it anchors a chain of reasoning that will eventually lead us to the culprit. He placed the letter beside a small inkwell, then turned his gaze toward the window. And consider the timing. Our so-called vampire operates under the cover of darkness, yet the exact hour is critical. The criminal has chosen it deliberately, aligning the act with the household's predictable routines. Observe, Watson, the elegance in this orchestration. I struggled to match his rapid deductions with my own medical logic. So this isn't about supernatural forces at all, I said, but about precise knowledge of the victim's habits, the house, and the predictable movements of the staff. Holmes allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. Exactly. The appearance of the impossible is a masterpiece of applied observation and psychological manipulation. We must think not only of what happened, but why it was designed to appear as it did. Only then will the solution become clear. We spent hours scrutinizing the scene. Holmes noting details invisible to my eyes, the faint residue on a windowsill, the pattern of footprints just beyond the carpet, the subtle scent of a particular type of cigar, left deliberately to mislead investigators. Each observation added another layer to the intricate web of deception. By the time we left the merchant's residence, my notebook was filled with sketches, notes, and observations. Yet I could sense that Holmes had already processed far more than he revealed. As we walked back through the fog-laden streets toward Baker Street, he remained quiet, his mind clearly running through scenarios, possibilities, and hypotheses that I could scarcely imagine. Tomorrow, Watson, he said finally, breaking the silence, we shall speak with the witnesses and the household staff. Their recollections, though imperfect, will provide further clues. And mark my words, among their statements lies the one discrepancy that will unravel the entire illusion. Patience, observation, and logic, these are our allies, even against a foe who appears to command the impossible. I followed silently, a mixture of apprehension and admiration filling me. If the crime had seemed confounding last night, it now appeared merely the first layer of a far more elaborate puzzle. Holmes' brilliance promised that by the end, every shadow, every deceptive mark, and every seemingly supernatural element would bow to reason, and I, as always, would bear witness to his genius. The streets of Whitechapel, steeped in mist and menace, had never seemed more alive with secrets. And I knew, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, that the next phase of our investigation would plunge us even deeper into the mind of a criminal whose cunning rivaled the darkness surrounding us. The following morning, Baker Street was alive with the quiet bustle of preparation, though the streets beyond remained cloaked in fog. Holmes moved with his usual brisk efficiency, organizing his notes and cross-referencing the observations he had made the night before. I, for my part, attempted to arrange my scattered sketches and preliminary conclusions into some semblance of order, though it was clear that my mind lagged behind his by several steps. The clues, minute and interconnected, demanded a patience I had not yet mastered. Holmes finally turned toward me, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Watson, the next stage is to interrogate the household and staff. Their recollections, though imperfect, are the fibers from which the truth may be woven. Yet we must tread carefully. People often mislead unintentionally when they seek to satisfy what they believe an investigator wants to hear. We made our way to the merchant's residence, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. As we entered, the household bustled nervously, servants casting wary glances at one another and at us. Holmes' presence seemed to simultaneously command respect and provoke anxiety. He moved directly toward the housekeeper, a woman whose age suggested decades of experience, yet whose eyes betrayed the strain of sleepless nights and unrelenting fear. "Madam," he began in his precise, disarming manner, "we wish to understand the sequence of events leading up to last night's tragedy. Your recollections, however fragmentary, may illuminate what appears at first glance impossible." The woman curtsied nervously. I will do my best, sir. It was awful, sir, dreadful, I assure you. I heard nothing until I entered the room and found him. Like that, the doors were locked, and, oh, sir, I cannot explain it. There was no one about yet. Her voice trailed off, swallowed by a sob. Holmes inclined his head slightly, observing her posture and mannerisms with meticulous attention. "Pray, tell us of the household's movements that evening. Did anything appear amiss, however small?" She hesitated, then recounted a series of minor irregularities: a misplaced candlestick, an unusually quiet servant, a muffled sound from the street below that she could not identify. Each detail seemed trivial at first, yet Holmes' eyes darted with keen interest. "Small inconsistencies," he murmured, almost to himself, "are often the clearest windows into truth." Turning next to the butler, Holmes maintained the same tone of subtle inquiry. The man's account, far more precise yet tinged with defensive pride, offered a different angle. He recalled seeing a shadow flit across the window shortly after the household had retired, though he dismissed it at the time as a trick of the fog. Holmes noted this without comment, his mind already assembling the threads. I took diligent notes, aware that each testimony added layers of complexity. The minor discrepancies, when considered together, painted a picture both coherent and confounding. Holmes, however, appeared singularly undisturbed, his thoughts moving along invisible pathways I could not yet trace. As we continued the interviews, Holmes occasionally paused to make subtle, almost imperceptible gestures, adjusting a piece of furniture, pointing with his gaze at an unusual angle, or noting the alignment of a shadow with a particular object. It was clear he was correlating the verbal testimonies with the physical environment, building a model of events that existed primarily in his mind. After completing the round of questioning, we withdrew to the quieter confines of a nearby parlor. Holmes sat in a chair, steepling his fingers, eyes half closed in contemplation. "Watson," he said softly, "observe the convergence of testimonies and physical evidence. Each person offers a piece, yet the complete image is obscured by what is intentionally left unsaid or misperceived. The solution lies precisely at the intersection of the overlooked and the overemphasized." I pressed for clarification, eager to grasp his meaning. "Do you refer to the window, the shadow the butler mentioned, or the candle?" "All of these, and yet none of them exclusively," Holmes replied. "The key is understanding why the criminal created these illusions. The psychological effect is as deliberate as the physical act itself. Fear is a veil. Logic must pierce it." He rose suddenly and paced to the window, fingers brushing the sill. "Consider, Watson, an intruder who understands the habits of this household, who manipulates both environment and perception, can create the appearance of impossibility. The marks on the floorboards, the arrangement of objects, the seemingly arbitrary details, all are components of an intricate ruse." I followed him, noting his meticulous attention to angle, distance, and proportion. "So the so-called vampire is simply a man exploiting fear and expectation?" Holmes' smile was thin and knowing. "Precisely. But one who executes such a plan must possess intimate knowledge of the household and the routines of its occupants. The criminal is not a stranger. He is embedded within the web he manipulates. And therein lies our true challenge, identifying the familiar hand that casts an unfamiliar shadow." As the afternoon waned, Holmes turned his attention to the letters, ledgers, and personal effects of the merchant, scrutinizing ink, handwriting, and subtle inconsistencies in paper quality. Each item, seemingly mundane, provided clues that only a mind attuned to the minutiae of human behavior could assemble into a coherent theory. "I have noted," Holmes said, "that the perpetrator has deliberately introduced red herrings, misleading trails designed to attract attention, while the true method lies elsewhere. Observe the candlestick, the window, the orientation of the carpet. These are decoys. The real clue is in what appears unremarkable, precisely because it has been overlooked by fear and expectation." I attempted to absorb his deductions, but I sensed that the full picture remained elusive. Each layer Holmes uncovered seemed to reveal yet another, deeper layer of cunning. And as dusk approached, casting elongated shadows across the room, it became clear that the Whitechapel vampire, though entirely human, had orchestrated a drama both elegant and terrifying, a drama that required the utmost patience, observation, and intellect to unravel. Holmes turned toward me, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Watson, our next step is to confirm what we suspect through subtle manipulation and controlled observation. The criminal must be drawn out, compelled to reveal the invisible hand behind these theatrics. And when that moment comes, the illusion of the impossible will dissolve, leaving only logic and consequence." I nodded, sensing both the thrill and the peril that lay ahead. The case, while appearing simple in its apparent horror, was in reality a labyrinth of deliberate deception. And as Holmes prepared the next phase of his investigation, I could not help but feel that we were on the cusp of uncovering a criminal whose intellect rivaled our own. If only we could anticipate the next move in this deadly game of shadows. The following morning, a damp chill clung to the streets of Whitechapel, and yet Holmes seemed invigorated by the atmosphere, as if the fog itself whispered clues to his acute senses. We returned to the merchant's residence, ostensibly to follow up on yesterday's inquiries, but I knew Holmes sought more than mere statements. He pursued subtle inconsistencies that others could scarcely detect. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the street, the walls, and the alleyways with an intensity that made the mundane seem suspicious. Every shadow a potential key to understanding. Inside, the household maintained a tense but orderly atmosphere, as if trying to convince themselves that normality still existed. Holmes greeted the servants cordially, yet with a penetrating gaze that quickly unsettled the less composed among them. "Madame," he said to the housekeeper, "we shall revisit the evening of the incident. Perhaps, in recalling the sequence of trivial events, a detail omitted previously may reveal itself. Memory, though imperfect, often hides the most illuminating truths in what one initially considers unimportant." The woman's hands trembled slightly as she recounted the evening anew, emphasizing small gestures she had neglected before: a servant's sudden disappearance from the hall, the faint creaking of the study door at a precise moment, the subtle shift in the pattern of lamplight across the walls as the evening waned. Holmes listened intently, nodding occasionally, yet betraying no indication of which pieces he considered critical. To me, they seemed minor, almost trivial, yet Holmes' manner suggested he discerned significance invisible to ordinary perception. After the housekeeper, Holmes turned his attention to the merchant's personal clerk, a young man whose nervous energy made him a repository of inadvertent revelations. "You were responsible for the accounts that evening?" Holmes inquired casually. The clerk nodded, glancing about nervously. "Did anything unusual occur while you attended to the ledgers?" Holmes' tone was light, almost conversational, yet carried an unmistakable weight that demanded precision. The clerk hesitated, then confessed a minor but notable irregularity. A ledger had been moved, not according to its usual pattern, and a letter intended for the merchant had been left conspicuously on the desk. On first hearing, it appeared insignificant, yet Holmes' eyes sharpened. "And the letter," he asked, "did it arrive by post or was it hand-delivered?" "Hand-delivered, sir," the clerk admitted. "I thought nothing of it at the time." Holmes' fingers lightly tapped the edge of the desk. "Precisely, Watson. It is the very ordinariness of this delivery that misleads. Hand-delivered letters are rare, and yet when inserted deliberately among the mundane, they become invisible to suspicion. Observe, the criminal uses our expectations against us, cloaking the unusual in the guise of the routine." I scribbled rapidly, trying to maintain pace with the torrent of deductions. Holmes then moved to a window, drawing the curtain aside slightly to examine the street below. "Consider the alignment of the lamps, the pattern of shadows, the timing of foot traffic. An intruder, even a cunning one, is constrained by physical realities. The appearance of the impossible, the locked doors, the seemingly inaccessible chamber, is only convincing when observed superficially." I noted the subtle detail he highlighted: a narrow ledge beneath a second-story window, damp and slippery, yet wide enough for a nimble individual. Could the perpetrator have used this? I ventured cautiously. Holmes allowed a faint smile. "Exactly, Watson. One must consider not only how the criminal acts, but how the act is perceived. The ordinary becomes extraordinary when framed by fear." Holmes' attention shifted suddenly to the fireplace, where a small mark on the hearth caught his eye. "Mark this, Watson. The smudge is faint but deliberate. Not a byproduct of the evening, but a trace of controlled action. The perpetrator manipulates the environment with care, ensuring that each misleading mark is placed to sustain the illusion. He crouched, examining it through his magnifying glass, then rose and moved to a chair, spinning it slightly to gauge its weight and position. Every gesture, though seemingly trivial, was part of a precise evaluation that would later reveal the pattern of the intruder's movements. He paused, his gaze fixed upon a chair that had been displaced. "Notice this, Watson. The displacement is not random. It was moved deliberately to suggest a struggle, to mislead witnesses and investigators alike. Yet the absence of real disturbance betrays the true nature of the crime, calculated, patient, methodical." I felt a chill as the implication sank in. This was no crime of passion or impulse, but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to instill terror while concealing the method. Holmes, I realized, was not merely solving a puzzle. He was dissecting a symphony of deception with precision and patience. Holmes' mind shifted seamlessly from observation to inference. "Now, Watson, we must consider the human factor. Motives, relationships, and opportunities. The criminal's familiarity with the household, the timing of actions, and the careful placement of misleading clues suggest someone who not only knew the environment, but understood the psychological tendencies of those within it. This is an intellect comfortable in the shadows, deliberate in the manipulation of fear and expectation." As if to punctuate his thought, he moved toward the merchant's writing desk, sifting through papers until a small folded envelope fell into view. "Observe, Watson. The envelope bears a watermark distinct from others in circulation, indicative of a particular manufacturer. A minor detail seemingly innocuous, yet it offers insight into the criminal's sources and habits. Each artifact, when considered with others, constructs a framework for deduction." I recorded each observation, sensing the complexity of the puzzle deepen. Holmes then gestured toward the layout of the room, aligning mental maps of movement with temporal accounts provided by the staff. Every shadow, every step, every mark is interconnected. The solution lies in the harmonization of these elements, a convergence that will reveal not merely what occurred, but how and why. Hours passed in this meticulous examination, and yet the fog outside had thickened, lending an almost spectral air to the room. Holmes, absorbed in the synthesis of physical clues, human testimony, and the subtleties of environment, occasionally paused to impart to me, almost as an aside, the methodology behind each deduction, the careful weighing of probability, the consideration of human nature, the elimination of misleading appearances. Finally, as the day waned and shadows lengthened unnaturally in the dim light, Holmes spoke with a quiet intensity. "Watson, the evidence converges upon a central point, hidden in plain sight. We are not yet ready to confront the criminal, but our next step must involve controlled observation to provoke a revealing action. The perpetrator's confidence in his misdirection will be his undoing. And mark my words, the minute deviation from expectation, the smallest slip, will unravel the entire fabric of deception." I nodded, feeling both anticipation and a sense of awe. Holmes' mind had already charted paths invisible to me, each thread of logic poised to expose the mastermind behind the so-called vampire mystery. Whitechapel streets, thick with mist and shadows, seemed charged with latent revelation, and I knew we were approaching a moment where the ordinary would finally expose the extraordinary through the piercing clarity of Holmes' intellect that the following morning broke with a faint drizzle. The streets of Whitechapel slick and glistening, reflecting the gaslight that had yet to be extinguished. Holmes and I walked in silence, each lost in thought, though I sensed the quiet intensity in his stride, the almost imperceptible tension that accompanied the mind at work. The previous day's meticulous inspection of the merchant's home had yielded numerous observations, yet Holmes' approach suggested that these were merely preliminary threads, awaiting integration into a larger tapestry. We arrived at the residence just as the household was stirring to the day's routines. Servants moved with careful precision, their eyes cast toward us with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Holmes' entrance was unassuming, yet every gesture, every glance, carried subtle authority. He began by revisiting the housekeeper, not to repeat yesterday's questioning, but to probe deeper into the minute discrepancies in her account. "Madam," he said softly, "I am interested in the movements that went unnoticed, the details your attention may have overlooked in your first recounting. Even the most innocuous action can reveal the character and timing of an intruder." Her eyes widened, and after a moment's hesitation, she recalled a brief shadow flickering across the corridor, a soft sound she had dismissed as the wind through a slightly ajar window. She also mentioned a small silver object displaced on the sideboard, which she had assumed to have been knocked over accidentally. Holmes noted these with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the significance of the overlooked minor disturbances. We moved next to the merchant's personal clerk, a young man still shaken but eager to cooperate. Holmes' inquiries were careful and deliberate, emphasizing the importance of precise timing and sequence. "You observed the letter, correct?" Holmes asked, tilting his head slightly. "Was it placed on the desk in a manner consistent with its delivery or otherwise?" The clerk hesitated, then explained that the envelope had been set down with a care that suggested intentionality. "It wasn't just left there," he said. "It was displayed in a way that I suppose I didn't think much of at the time." Holmes' eyes gleamed with interest, noting the subtle implications. "Exactly," he said softly. "Intentional placement is often more revealing than forced action. It indicates familiarity, confidence, and a calculated understanding of perception. Observe, Watson, the clever criminal does not simply commit a crime. He choreographs it to manipulate those who witness it." As the morning progressed, Holmes turned his attention to the physical environment. He examined the arrangement of furniture, the orientation of the carpet, and the faint marks on the hearth and window sills. Each element, seemingly insignificant, was considered in relation to the others. Holmes' deductions moved fluidly from the material to the psychological, bridging the tangible with the strategic. "Consider, Watson," he said, crouching beside a small scuff near the window, "the placement of this mark. It is too deliberate to be accidental. The intruder sought to create a narrative of struggle and intrusion, yet in reality, this is an orchestrated misdirection. The path taken, the marks left behind, and the sequence of movements are all part of a design intended to deceive and confound." I followed his examination with growing comprehension, noting the subtle interplay between environmental cues and psychological manipulation. Holmes' mind was assembling a pattern invisible to the casual observer, revealing the meticulous logic behind the apparent chaos. After completing the room inspection, Holmes directed his attention to the timeline of events provided by the household staff. By carefully correlating their accounts, he identified small inconsistencies, slight discrepancies in the reported times of movements, minor contradictions in descriptions of sounds, and subtle shifts in positioning of objects. These were not errors of deceit, he explained, but artifacts of fear, distraction, and human imperfection. And yet, when integrated with his observations, they became vital pieces in understanding the intruder's method. Holmes then paused, fixing his gaze upon the desk where the letter had been placed. "The envelope, Watson," he murmured, "serves as both a red herring and a marker. Its deliberate display guides attention away from the subtle traces that truly reveal the perpetrator's approach and departure. The criminal relies upon our natural inclinations to interpret the overt as significant while ignoring the hidden." I tried to absorb his reasoning, feeling the enormity of the challenge. It was no longer merely a question of identifying a method of entry. We were unraveling a complex strategy designed to exploit fear, perception, and expectation. Holmes' calm, methodical approach contrasted sharply with the dread that had permeated the household, highlighting the chasm between instinctive fear and rational deduction. Holmes' thoughts then shifted toward the human factor. Observe, Watson. The perpetrator must possess intimate knowledge of the household's routines, of the likely movements of its inhabitants. The timing, placement, and even the choice of instruments are dictated not by whim, but by precise calculation. The criminal is not a stranger. He is someone who has rehearsed this in the mind long before acting. As we discussed these deductions, Holmes suddenly stood, moving toward the window. And there is one more element, Watson, which cannot be ignored, the element of observation. The intruder must have anticipated how each action would be perceived, predicting the interpretations of those who would encounter the scene. Fear, expectation, and assumption are tools as potent as any lock or weapon. I understood then that the investigation was entering a new phase. It was no longer sufficient to gather facts or to examine the scene. We needed to anticipate the criminal psychology, to predict the next step, and to set a trap informed by meticulous reasoning. Holmes' mind, always several moves ahead, had begun to construct a scenario that would compel the perpetrator to reveal the invisible logic behind the staged supernatural appearance. By midday, Holmes had outlined a subtle plan of observation and manipulation. "Tomorrow, Watson," he said, "we shall introduce controlled stimuli, observe reactions, and note deviations from expectation. Even the smallest slip and inconsistency in movement, a hesitation, a misalignment will provide the clue that resolves the puzzle. The criminal's confidence, his reliance on misdirection, will be his undoing." We left the residence with a renewed sense of purpose. The streets of Whitechapel still cloaked in fog, yet now filled with potential revelation. Each alleyway, each doorway, and each shadow seemed charged with significance, and I realized that Holmes' extraordinary perception rendered the ordinary extraordinary. The true challenge lay ahead, to convert his abstract deductions into a tangible confrontation that would expose the mastermind behind the terrifying illusion of the vampire. As we walked back toward Baker Street, the drizzle softened to mist, and I could not help but feel the weight of anticipation. Holmes' strategy required patience, precision, and an understanding of human behavior at its most subtle. Yet, despite the complexity, I trusted implicitly in his ability to synthesize observation, logic, and psychology into a singular clarity that would unravel the Whitechapel vampire mystery. The stage was set, and the next move would determine whether the carefully constructed web of deception would finally be laid bare. The morning air on Baker Street was heavy with damp fog, and yet Holmes seemed untroubled by the gloom. His energy focused entirely on the unraveling of the Whitechapel mystery. I could scarcely keep pace with his thoughts, which seemed to dart ahead of us as if anticipating events not yet unfolded. The plan he had outlined the day before occupied his mind, and though he spoke little, his every gesture and movement betrayed a mind actively plotting the next phase of the investigation. We arrived at the merchant's residence once again, not merely as observers but as subtle catalysts, prepared to observe reactions that might betray the hidden manipulations of our adversary. Holmes' eyes roamed the interior with that same intensity that always unnerved me, noting angles, distances, and the orientation of objects that others considered insignificant. He paused briefly at the fireplace, fingers brushing lightly against the hearth, then moved deliberately to the desk where the mysterious letter had been placed. "Watson," he murmured, "observe how confidence can be a misdirection. Our criminal trusts in the stability of his deception. He presumes that the obvious will divert attention from the subtle, and that fear will eclipse logic. Today, we begin to test those presumptions." Holmes began by reconstructing small details of the room. Chairs were repositioned, minor obstacles deliberately adjusted, and the light from the windows manipulated with curtains. Each alteration was minimal, almost imperceptible, yet designed to provoke a reaction. The household staff observed quietly, their unease growing under the subtle pressure of Holmes' presence. Though they could not articulate why, we spoke first with the housekeeper, guiding her to recount the night's events while Holmes observed her gestures, her eyes, and her micro-expressions. "Recall, if you can, the sequence in which you moved through the rooms," he prompted gently. "Even minor variations can provide insight into the perception of those involved, and, by extension, the movements of our intruder." Her recounting was careful and precise. Yet Holmes' sharp eyes detected inconsistencies, however slight, that suggested the path of the intruder had intersected with areas she had not consciously noted. When she mentioned a faint noise near the sideboard, Holmes leaned forward, examining the dust patterns beneath it. "Ah," he said softly, "the alignment is subtly altered. Our friend anticipates attention, yet miscalculates by the smallest margin. That margin, Watson, is the thread that will unravel his entire scheme." I watched him, fascinated, as he mapped the house in his mind, integrating the physical observations with psychological deductions. The clerk was next, and Holmes employed a similar tactic, casually guiding him through a reenactment of his actions the previous evening, while observing for hesitations or overcorrections. "Even the most conscientious witness," Holmes noted, "reveals patterns of expectation rather than objective truth. Our adversary relies upon these patterns to construct a narrative that appears flawless." After completing the interviews, Holmes moved toward the window, lifting the curtain slightly to observe the street below. "Note the ledges, the angles, and the potential routes of entry," he said. "The intruder, constrained by the realities of space and movement, must have chosen a path both practical and psychologically effective. One is left to wonder if the design of fear is the more compelling element or the method itself." I followed his gaze, trying to imagine the route. A narrow ledge extended from the side of the building, slick with condensation, and yet it could be traversed by someone nimble. Holmes' attention shifted to a subtle indentation on the sill, almost invisible, suggesting repeated contact. "Exactly, Watson. The criminal is familiar with these surfaces, his movements calculated to avoid leaving detectable traces. Yet, even the most careful calculation cannot account for every variable. And therein lies the opportunity for discovery." He then returned to the desk, retrieving the mysterious letter, and examined its envelope with the precision of a surgeon inspecting delicate tissue. "Watermark, ink, and folding style," he murmured. "Even in what appears routine, minute irregularities betray intention. Our adversary is clever, but cleverness always leaves an imprint for those who know where to look." Holmes paused, considering the alignment of all observations. "We must now predict the next move. The criminal's confidence in his own ingenuity will guide him to repeat patterns, introduce familiar diversions, and exploit fear once more. If we are correct, our task is to place stimuli that compel a reaction, revealing the hidden logic behind the illusion." We left the residence briefly, returning with subtle tools of observation, discrete markers, slight adjustments to lighting, and small objects positioned to record interaction. Holmes explained that these were not traps in the conventional sense, but instruments to elicit unconscious signals, movements, or choices that would betray the intruder's knowledge and habits. By early afternoon, Holmes had completed his preparations. He instructed the household to continue with their routines, deliberately leaving small objects slightly askew, minor noises to punctuate the environment, and careful shadows cast to suggest movement in areas that would otherwise be empty. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The intruder is already watching, confident that the ordinary will deceive us. Yet the extraordinary is hidden in what appears mundane, and that is where we shall find him." As the hours passed, Holmes moved silently from room to room, noting reactions to the altered environment, a subtle glance, a slight adjustment of a chair, a hesitation before entering a corridor. Each micro-reaction was catalogued in his mind, correlated with the prior testimonies, and compared against the expected behavior of anyone unfamiliar with the household. I could only record what I observed, knowing that Holmes was processing connections beyond my comprehension. Finally, as the day waned, a subtle shift occurred. The butler, moving with routine precision, paused near the desk and adjusted a letter ever so slightly. Holmes' eyes narrowed, and he signaled me to observe quietly. The adjustment was almost imperceptible, yet it confirmed the hypothesis. Someone with intimate knowledge of the household and its routines was manipulating events. Their actions guided by both habit and intention. Holmes whispered, "There, Watson." A slip so minor that no one else would perceive it, yet it reveals volumes. The intruder trusts in the predictability of those around him, yet even confidence leaves cracks. That single act confirms our theory. The person responsible is not a stranger, but someone embedded within the household or its familiar circles, whose knowledge of habits allows for the illusion of the impossible. I felt a thrill of anticipation. The meticulous orchestration of environment, psychology, and timing was beginning to yield results. Holmes' plan of observation, patience, and subtle manipulation was working. And the Whitechapel vampire, though still unseen, was beginning to expose himself through the faintest of signals. Holmes turned to me with a rare expression of restrained satisfaction. "Watson, the stage is set. Now we wait for the next movement, the next deviation. The criminal's own methods will betray him, and when the final piece falls into place, the illusion of the supernatural will collapse entirely under the weight of logic and observation. Every misdirection has a purpose, and now, every purpose has a consequence." I nodded, understanding at last that the pursuit was not simply of a person, but of a mind, a careful, calculating intellect that reveled in the manipulation of fear. And as we prepared for the hours ahead, I knew that the culmination of our patience and deduction would bring the Whitechapel vampire into the light, where the truth would emerge with the clarity that only Holmes could command. The evening settled over Whitechapel with a muted hush. Fog curling around lampposts and curling through narrow alleys as if the city itself were conspiring to obscure the truth. Holmes and I returned to the merchant's residence with deliberate quiet, careful not to disturb the household, yet fully prepared to observe any anomalies. The subtle manipulations we had introduced earlier, the minor rearrangements, faint noises, and slight adjustments to light and shadow were intended to provoke a response. And Holmes moved with the patience of a predator. Knowing that the intruder would act in predictable yet revealing ways, we stationed ourselves in the parlor, concealed by shadows with an unobstructed view of the main corridor. Holmes' eyes flicked constantly, noting the alignment of objects, the position of the chairs, and the faint gleam of the polished floorboards. He spoke softly, almost to himself, but I caught each word. "Observe, Watson, the criminal's ingenuity lies not in brute force, but in the exploitation of expectation. Confidence, predictability, and the careful orchestration of fear are his tools. Our task is to let him reveal them of his own volition." The household moved about in routine, the servants performing tasks with quiet diligence. Holmes had instructed them to continue as normal, subtly emphasizing small imperfections we had arranged to test reactions. Minutes stretched into an hour, the fog outside thickening, until the slight creak of a floorboard drew our attention. A shadow moved across the hallway, a fluid, deliberate motion, and Holmes' eyes glimmered with recognition. "There," he whispered. Barely audible, "Our friend is active." The figure approached the study door, pausing briefly, almost as if assessing the room, and then proceeded with careful precision to adjust an item on the desk, a small silver inkstand that we had placed deliberately. Holmes' lips curved in a faint smile. "Notice, Watson, the choice of action. The intruder is familiar with the household, with its habits and objects, yet he cannot resist altering them to maintain the narrative of disruption. Each movement confirms our suspicion. Intimate knowledge, careful planning, and the deliberate creation of fear. I felt my pulse quicken as we observed the intruder from the shadows. The figure's movements were calculated, yet slight hesitations betrayed him. Holmes leaned closer, his eyes scanning every micro-expression, every shift in posture. "Even perfection leaves traces," he murmured. "Observe the minute adjustments, the small inconsistencies. They reveal the mind behind the illusion, the individual who believes themselves untouchable, but cannot escape the laws of logic and consequence." The intruder moved toward the window, inspecting the sill and glancing toward the narrow ledge outside. He paused, as if considering an escape route or a line of approach, and then retraced his steps, touching the desk again in a precise, deliberate motion. Holmes rose silently, indicating for me to follow. "We shall not confront him prematurely," he whispered. "Our task is to guide him, to allow the culmination of his pattern to reveal itself without interference. Any misstep, however minor, will be our key." Holmes returned briefly to the hall, adjusting the orientation of a lamp to cast a faint shadow along the corridor, then resumed his hidden position. We watched as the intruder, fully absorbed in his own calculations, moved toward the fireplace, pausing once to examine a mark we had made earlier. His hand lingered slightly, tracing the edge of the scuff, then retreated. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "A touch too deliberate," he said softly. "Confidence, yet the faint tremor of anticipation. This is the slip we have been waiting for. Watch closely, Watson." Minutes passed with no further action, the tension building in the parlor. Then the figure glanced toward the parlor itself, his gaze lingering as if sensing observation, and Holmes made a subtle movement, a slight shift that cast the light differently across the room. The intruder stiffened, hesitation flickering across his posture, before he proceeded with renewed caution. Holmes' voice was barely audible, yet precise. "Now, Watson, note the sequence. Each movement, each glance, is deliberate. But the deviation, the hesitation at the recognition of surveillance, is the crucial clue. The criminal's confidence is beginning to falter, and that faltering will expose the methodology we seek." The intruder approached the sideboard, adjusting an item almost exactly as we had predicted. Then, with a slight misalignment of the object, he triggered a small bell we had installed earlier as part of our observation setup. The sound was soft, but sufficient to catch his attention, and Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Perfect, Watson. The minor disturbance is sufficient. Observe his reaction." The intruder paused, scanning the room quickly, his movements now tinged with uncertainty. He returned to the desk, examining papers and letters, then hesitated again. Holmes leaned closer to me, whispering, "The pattern is revealed." He repeats actions, introduces minor variations to maintain the illusion, yet cannot resist leaving consistent markers that betray intimate knowledge. The moment of uncertainty, this is the pivot. I followed his gaze as the intruder, growing increasingly cautious, moved to the study door. His hand hovered over the handle, then retreated, as if reconsidering the route. Holmes' quiet intensity was almost palpable. "Notice, Watson, the reliance on routine. The criminal has rehearsed these actions, yet deviation from expectation has created a fissure. From this fissure, we shall extract the truth." Suddenly, the intruder shifted his focus to the ledger, flipping through pages with deliberate care, then replaced it incorrectly, subtly misaligning the entries. Holmes' lips curved into a faint smile. "Yes," he murmured, "the first real slip. A detail minute, almost imperceptible, yet utterly revealing. From this alone, we can reconstruct his movements, his knowledge, and ultimately his identity." The intruder moved again, toward the corridor leading to the back staircase. Holmes gestured silently for me to remain hidden, and we observed the shadowed figure ascend cautiously, each step betraying a mixture of familiarity and tension. "Observe, Watson," Holmes whispered. "He believes himself unseen, yet the weight of logic and observation follows him. Every action carries a signature, a trace of his intelligence and his familiarity. He cannot hide from deduction. We followed him from a distance, careful to maintain our concealment. Holmes' deductions unfolded with rapid clarity as we moved. The sequence of rooms, the timing of movements, the placement of objects, and the psychological manipulation of the household all converged to reveal a pattern we could now interpret with confidence. Finally, the intruder paused near a small storage room, examining the door and its lock. Holmes turned toward me, his expression resolute. "Watson, the moment of exposure is near." He has demonstrated both confidence and uncertainty, knowledge and fear. By our careful orchestration, he has revealed himself not by force, but by subtle repetition. We are ready to act, yet must do so with precision. Any premature move, and the pattern collapses. I nodded, feeling the tension and anticipation mounting. The hours of patient observation, the subtle manipulations, and the intricate deductions were coalescing. The Whitechapel vampire, though still unseen in the conventional sense, was exposing himself through method, habit, and intellect. And in that exposure lay the certainty that Holmes, through sheer logic and unerring attention to detail, would bring the mystery to its inevitable resolution. The night deepened over Whitechapel, thick fog curling between the buildings and muffling distant sounds, creating an atmosphere that seemed both oppressive and expectant. Holmes and I remained in the shadows of the back corridor, silent witnesses to the movements of the intruder we now understood with increasing clarity. Every subtle motion, every micro-adjustment, and every hesitation had been catalogued by Holmes, each observation folding neatly into the pattern he had begun to construct from the outset. The intruder was no mere opportunist. He was deliberate, methodical, and skilled in manipulating both space and perception. As the figure paused near the storage room, Holmes motioned for me to follow at a careful distance. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "The intruder is guided by routine and familiarity, yet uncertainty has begun to erode his confidence. That hesitation will be the key. He believes himself in control, but our orchestration has introduced variables he cannot anticipate." We crept along the corridor, remaining unseen as the intruder examined the lock on the storage door. His hand lingered, tracing the edge of the latch before moving away as if reconsidering his method of entry. Holmes' eyes flicked toward me with that subtle gleam of satisfaction. I had learned to recognize he had anticipated this hesitation, knew precisely what it revealed, and was already formulating the next step in his strategy. "Notice. Watson," he murmured. "The intruder manipulates objects to convey intention. Every displacement, every mark, is part of a performance meant to suggest action where none occurred. Yet he cannot suppress small, unconscious signs, the tremor of the hand, the alignment of objects, the timing of movements. These betray him more than any overt evidence could." I observed as the intruder shifted his attention to the floor, lightly brushing dust aside with a careful, deliberate motion. He stepped back, examined the scuff marks we had previously noted, and then retreated slightly, as if confirming his own assumptions against the traces left behind. Holmes' gaze followed each movement, calculating in real time the sequence and purpose of every action. "He is laying his narrative, Watson," Holmes whispered, "but we have rewritten it without his knowledge. By adjusting the environment, we have created cues that mislead and provoke, and the intruder, confident in his planning, has followed them precisely. He is revealing his logic even as he seeks to conceal it." The figure then moved toward the corridor that led to the main parlor, and Holmes signaled for me to pause. "Patience," he said softly, "for this is the moment when the criminal's own method begins to betray him. Notice the timing, the sequence, and the interaction with the environment. Even perfection leaves traces." The intruder hesitated at the threshold, as if sensing observation, then stepped carefully into the room. He moved to the desk, touching letters and objects with deliberate care, aligning them almost exactly as he had intended. yet leaving imperceptible deviations that Holmes had predicted. The slight misalignment of a letter, the angle of a pen, the faint disturbance of dust, all indicated the presence of knowledge and planning. Yet a minor lapse in precision had already provided the critical clue. Holmes crouched slightly, whispering, "Observe his hand, Watson. Note the micro-adjustments." Confidence conflicts with caution, and the result is a signal visible only to the discerning eye. We are now within reach of the revelation we seek. The intruder then moved toward the window, inspecting the sill and the narrow ledge outside. He glanced back at the room, as if to ensure the scene appeared untouched by our manipulations, before proceeding to replace a small object we had deliberately repositioned. It was an almost imperceptible movement, yet Holmes leaned closer, his eyes narrowing in satisfaction. "There," he whispered, "the moment of unguarded precision. He believes himself in command, yet the micro-deviation confirms his familiarity and intent. Every aspect of his action is a signature of intellect, calculation, and familiarity with the household. He cannot escape the consequences of methodical thought." I watched, tense with anticipation, as the intruder ascended the small staircase to the upper hall. Holmes followed silently, mapping each step, each pause, and each glance against the pattern of behavior we had already discerned. "The upper hall is the stage for the critical action," Holmes murmured. "Observe closely. Here, the intersection of expectation and calculation will expose the criminal fully." As we reached the landing, we could see the figure lingering near the door of a small, unused room. His hand hovered over the knob, then withdrew, and Holmes' eyes glimmered with satisfaction. "The hesitation is his undoing, Watson," he whispered. "Even the most meticulous calculation falters under the weight of the unforeseen. By this hesitation, we know the intruder anticipates observation, yet cannot fully account for the variables we have introduced." Holmes moved a step closer, adjusting his position to maintain concealment yet gain a better perspective. The intruder finally turned to the window again, examining the ledge and the angle of escape, before retreating slightly and returning to the desk in the room below. His movements were careful, yet every repetition of prior gestures only reinforced the pattern we had already reconstructed. "Notice, Watson," Holmes said softly, "the repetition. It is deliberate, habitual, and yet each repetition leaves a trace, a minor but decisive clue. The intruder relies upon routine, and that reliance is precisely what exposes him. His intellect is formidable, but even intellect cannot escape observable consequence." The intruder finally withdrew from the desk, moving toward the main hall with the same calculated precision we had predicted. Holmes' voice was a low murmur, full of anticipation. "Now, Watson, observe the final alignment. Each movement converges toward the inevitable exposure. The criminal's own method, his reliance on familiarity and expectation, has constructed a map that leads directly to him. All that remains is to allow him to complete the pattern." We followed at a careful distance as he moved toward the sideboard, replacing the silver inkstand once more, then paused as if considering the next step. Holmes' eyes flicked to mine, a subtle signal that the moment was near. He will now perform an action intended to reinforce the illusion of fear, yet in doing so, he reveals the sequence of his intent. Watch the timing, the alignment, the interaction with objects. This will be the proof we need. As the intruder paused, examining his surroundings and performing a final minor adjustment, Holmes straightened slightly. "Watson, the conclusion is upon us. The minute of certainty, the deviation from perfection, and the habitual reliance on knowledge and expectation have combined. From this we shall discern the perpetrator, his method, and the logic behind the supernatural facade that has so terrified Whitechapel." I felt a surge of anticipation, understanding for the first time the precision of Holmes' strategy. The patient orchestration of environment, observation, And subtle manipulation had brought the criminal to a point where his own methods were betraying him. The Whitechapel vampire, though still cloaked in shadow, was poised to be revealed by the inexorable logic of Holmes' deduction. And the final act of exposure was within reach. The night had grown denser, the fog outside pressing against the windows as though it sought to swallow the narrow streets whole. And yet, within the house, every detail, no matter how slight, seemed to pulse with possibility. Holmes crouched in the shadows near the staircase, his eyes fixed on the subtle movements below, while I remained beside him, recording each observation, though fully aware that my understanding could not match his. The intruder's meticulous care was evident, yet now it was tinged with the hesitation that Holmes had predicted. Every motion seemed carefully choreographed, yet the weight of observation had begun to show in the smallest tremors. The figure descended from the upper hall slowly, stepping lightly, almost reverently, toward the desk where letters and objects had been subtly repositioned earlier. Holmes' eyes tracked the slightest tremble in the hand, the micro-adjustment of a folded note, the careful alignment of an inkstand. "See, Watson," he whispered, "even the most deliberate intellect cannot suppress unconscious revelation. He believes himself in control, yet every movement betrays the structure of his reasoning." The intruder paused, glancing toward the parlor as if sensing our presence, though we remained unseen. He adjusted a chair, touched the corner of the desk lightly, then moved to examine a ledger lying open upon the surface. Each page he touched was slightly shifted, revealing that he was confirming prior arrangements and sequences, checking against the mental map he had constructed. Holmes' lips curved in a faint smile. "Now, Watson, observe closely. The pattern is complete. Every movement repeats the logic of his prior actions, yet the deviations we have introduced force him to betray intention. The sequence is now self-revealing." I leaned forward, straining to see what Holmes so clearly discerned. The intruder returned to the desk, his gaze sweeping the room as if reconciling the physical arrangement with his own expectations. He reached for the small silver inkstand, aligning it almost perfectly, yet leaving a subtle angular deviation that Holmes immediately noted. "A signature of intellect," Holmes murmured, "a mark of familiarity and precision, and yet the deviation exists. This is our window, Watson, our key to exposing the method behind the illusion." The intruder then approached the fireplace, examining the hearth with deliberate care, brushing away faint traces of dust that he could not entirely erase. Holmes whispered, "See how he maintains the narrative of supernatural activity, manipulating objects and spaces to create fear, yet the very precision required leaves a trace of calculation. His genius is revealed by what he believes concealed." Suddenly, a small, deliberate sound, a faint click from the sideboard we had prepared, caused the intruder to stiffen, his hand momentarily halting mid-motion. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Ah, Watson, notice the falter. He has been provoked, subtly by forces he cannot perceive. That micro-reaction confirms both the presence of observation and the precise knowledge required to maintain control. His response is now predictable. His next move will expose him fully." The intruder moved toward the window, inspecting the narrow ledge outside and tracing his path with careful scrutiny. Holmes whispered, "He is planning an exit, yet constrained by familiarity and expectation. Every step, every hesitation, reinforces the mental map we have constructed. He cannot escape the consequences of deliberate planning." I followed his gaze as the figure turned, examining the floor and the edges of the furniture, before moving back to the desk. Holmes' voice was a low murmur of satisfaction. "Notice the repetition, Watson. Deliberate, controlled, and yet unavoidable in its regularity. The intruder is bound by habit as surely as he is guided by intellect. Every repetition consolidates the proof we require." The intruder's next actions were subtle yet revealing, a slight adjustment of the ledger, a careful repositioning of the inkstand, a fleeting glance toward the parlor, and then a momentary pause as if weighing the next move. Holmes leaned closer, whispering, "The hesitation is critical." He anticipates interference, yet cannot calculate our observation perfectly. That anticipation betrays both his confidence and the constraints of his intellect. Observe the alignment of gestures and intention. They form a map that leads directly to him. As the intruder moved toward the sideboard once more, his hand brushing lightly against a small vase, Holmes signaled me to remain silent and patient. "Now, Watson," he murmured, "everything is converging. The sequence of movement, the deviations from perfection, and the reliance upon familiar routines all converge to expose both the individual and the method. We must allow him to complete this pattern, for in that completion lies our revelation." The figure paused, examining the desk and the objects upon it, before moving toward the hallway once more. His movements were careful, deliberate, yet faint tremors betrayed an awareness of being watched, even if he could not see us. Holmes' eyes glimmered with satisfaction. The final acts of calculation are always the most revealing. The tension between confidence and caution leaves a signature that cannot be hidden. We are now within moments of full exposure. We followed at a measured distance as the intruder approached the main entrance, his attention focused on the placement of objects and the alignment of space. Holmes whispered, "Every object he touches, every adjustment, reinforces his reliance upon routine and expectation. Yet each small imperfection, induced by our orchestration, reveals the logic behind the illusion. He is constructing fear, but simultaneously betraying his intellect." Finally, the intruder paused at the doorway, glancing about the room, then moved toward the hallway that led to the back stairs. Holmes' whisper was almost a breath. "Observe, Watson, the moment approaches." His methodical nature, his reliance upon calculated sequence, and the subtle deviations we have introduced will now culminate in self-revelation. The Whitechapel vampire, though unseen, is now revealed in the traces of intellect and habit he cannot suppress. I felt a mixture of anticipation and awe. Holmes' orchestration of environment, observation, and subtle manipulation had brought the intruder to the brink of exposure. Each hesitation, every micro-adjustment, and all the repetition had combined to create a scenario where his own actions were the key to unveiling both identity and method. And as we poised ourselves for the final convergence, I knew that the culmination of patient observation and deductive precision would soon make the mysterious and terrifying figure of the Whitechapel vampire entirely comprehensible. Holmes' eyes gleamed as he observed the intruder's next move, every calculation in his mind lining up with the reality before him. "Now, Watson," he whispered, "we are ready to close the loop. The next action, the next decision, will illuminate the method, reveal the intellect, and strip away the cloak of fear that has masked the truth. The endgame is at hand." The tension in the air had become almost tangible, as though the very fog pressing against the windows had conspired to still every sound, amplifying each subtle movement and hushed breath within the house. Holmes and I lingered in the shadows near the staircase, watching the intruder carefully retrace his steps, a precise sequence of gestures and hesitations that seemed at once deliberate and inevitably revealing. Each minor adjustment, the tilt of a letter, the shift of a ledger, the alignment of the silver inkstand, was recorded meticulously in Holmes' mind. Constructing a full map of the intruder's method, "The culmination is near," Holmes whispered, his voice a low threat of intensity. "Observe, Watson, the interplay of confidence and caution. Every action he performs to project control is simultaneously an act of self-betrayal. This is how intellect, however cunning, leaves traces." The intruder approached the main hall, his steps careful but deliberate. His hand hovered over the sideboard before making a minute adjustment, then paused, glancing toward the parlor, seemingly sensing our unseen presence. Holmes' eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "Notice the hesitation," he murmured. Even the smallest pause betrays calculation, for it arises from anticipation of the unpredictable. He knows the environment, but cannot anticipate manipulation he does not perceive. That is our leverage. I followed closely, straining to observe each subtle movement. The intruder moved to the hallway leading to the back stairs, his attention fixed on the floor and furniture arrangement. He touched the corner of a rug, lifted it slightly, and replaced it with exacting care. Holmes' whispered commentary was precise. Each repetition, each alignment, consolidates the pattern. He believes himself in control of perception, yet the trace of intellect, his signature, is unavoidable. The smallest imperfection contains revelation. The intruder paused mid-step, surveying the staircase with deliberate caution. His hand brushed the railing lightly, as if testing its integrity, then retreated. Holmes signaled for me to remain quiet, his gaze piercing the dim corridor. "The intruder now faces the final vector of exposure," he said softly. "He will perform one more action to complete his sequence, and in doing so, the logic of his entire operation will be laid bare. Watch carefully." From our concealed vantage, I saw him descend the staircase slowly, each step a calculated measure. He approached a door that led to a small, seldom-used room, pausing to examine the lock. Holmes' eyes flicked toward mine, alert and intent. "See the micro-adjustment, Watson?" His hand trembles imperceptibly. The tension between habitual precision and fear of the unknown leaves a signature. That signature is the proof we require. The intruder finally opened the door, stepping inside with deliberate care. Objects on a small table were subtly disturbed books, papers, and a delicate writing quill, all aligned in ways that suggested preparation. Yet imperceptible deviations betrayed unconscious oversight. Holmes whispered, "The intrusion is methodical, yet perfection is impossible." Each touch, each alignment, is a vector revealing both intention and identity. He moved toward the back corner of the room, examining a trunk that had been left slightly ajar. His hand hovered, paused, then touched the latch, tilting it slightly. Holmes leaned closer to me, his voice low and charged with anticipation. "The culmination is here. The intruder's habitual reliance on knowledge, sequence, and expectation has constructed a pattern we can now interpret fully. Observe the interaction with the trunk. It is the final vector." I watched as he opened the trunk carefully, revealing its contents, papers, garments, and a collection of tools that suggested careful planning and a penchant for theatrical deception. Yet even as he inspected, he arranged and realigned each object with meticulous care, leaving minor, almost imperceptible errors. Holmes' eyes gleamed with triumph. "See, Watson, every adjustment confirms the method, the intellect, and the signature of the individual. The micro-deviations are the proof, the unassailable evidence of the criminal's identity and reasoning." The intruder then paused, turning toward the window as if to reconnoiter a potential escape. Holmes whispered sharply, "He anticipates the unpredictable, yet the variables we introduced have already forced him into revelation. Notice the conflict between intention and calculation, every hesitation. Every adjustment is now a confirmation of identity." I realized, as Holmes had long insisted, that the entire performance, the careful movements, the minute alignments, the subtle manipulations of objects had been an unconscious confession. The intruder, confident in his control and theatrical in his methods, had left behind a trail of logic, unbroken and traceable. The figure moved back to the center of the room, briefly glancing at the floor, then at the doorway, and finally toward the staircase. Holmes' voice was a near whisper, yet carried unmistakable certainty. "Now, Watson, we act." The final act of observation is complete, the pattern revealed in its entirety. The intruder, in his attempt to manipulate perception and fabricate fear, has betrayed himself through the consistency and minutiae of his own method. With careful precision, Holmes stepped from the shadows, his presence immediately commanding. The intruder froze, startled, his hand half raised toward the trunk. "I believe, sir," Holmes said, his tone calm yet razor-sharp, "that your evening of meticulous planning has yielded more revelation than you intended. You have constructed fear, manipulated space, and curated illusion, but in doing so, you have left the clearest signature of intellect and method." The intruder's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition and panic crossing his face as he instinctively reached for a potential escape. Holmes' gaze remained unyielding. "I suggest, sir, that further movement would be unwise. The pattern is complete, and your identity, intentions, and methodology have been fully discerned." The man's facade faltered, his deliberate movements replaced by hesitation and uncertainty. Every micro-adjustment, every habitual gesture that had betrayed him over the past hours, converged into the inevitable realization that his carefully constructed illusion was at an end. Holmes' subtle orchestration of environment, observation, and deduction had succeeded in compelling the final confession through logic, observation, and inevitability alone. I stepped forward cautiously, mirroring Holmes' measured movements, while he spoke again, calmly and with precision. "Your efforts to mimic fear and to cultivate a legend of the supernatural have been most inventive. Yet in truth, all that is required to unravel deception is attention to detail, consistency of observation, and the patient application of deduction." The intruder's shoulders slumped slightly, the tension of the evening finally yielding. Holmes' keen eyes had mapped the entire sequence of his actions, identified the subtle hesitations, and reconstructed the complete logic of his plan. The Whitechapel vampire, terrifying as rumor had rendered him, now stood exposed, not as a creature of the night, but as a man whose intellect and methods had been outmatched by the unerring precision of Sherlock Holmes' observation and deduction. Holmes turned toward me with a faint smile, his satisfaction tempered by characteristic modesty. "Watson, the final act is not force or confrontation, but the inevitability of logic itself. Fear and illusion crumble in the presence of methodical reasoning. The case at last is fully within our grasp." We stood in the quiet room, the fog pressing against the windows outside, the intruder's figure tense yet subdued before us, and I realized that for all its terror and mystery, the Whitechapel vampire's story had been unmasked not through spectacle, but through meticulous observation, patient deduction, and the relentless application of logic, the very tools Holmes wielded with unsurpassed mastery. Holmes' gaze never wavered from the intruder, whose breathing had begun to quicken in the realization that his carefully constructed world of fear and illusion had been penetrated. The man's composure, so meticulously cultivated over hours of careful maneuvering, now faltered under the scrutiny of the detective's unerring observation. Each subtle tick, each hesitation, each flicker of his eyes betrayed the calculated effort that had gone into perpetuating the legend of the Whitechapel vampire. Holmes took a measured step forward, the faint echo of his boots on the wooden floor slicing through the tense silence. "You see, sir," he said softly, yet with unmistakable authority, "even the most ingenious designs cannot escape the consequences of logic and method. You have attempted to fabricate fear, to bend perception, but the truth reveals itself through the minutiae of your own actions." The intruder's shoulders slumped further, his hand falling from the edge of the trunk. His eyes darted around the room, as if seeking an unseen accomplice or a hidden escape route. How could you know?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I took every precaution. Every step was planned, every move calculated." Holmes inclined his head slightly, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "And yet, you see, it is precisely because of the planning, the careful calculation, that your method betrayed you. Every adjustment, every repeated motion, Every unconscious deviation from perfection has left a trail traces that any observer of sufficient patience and acuity would recognize. Your intellect, though formidable, cannot elude the inevitability of consequence. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from fear, but from awe at the precision of Holmes' reasoning. The intruder, despite his cleverness, was now exposed in every micro-gesture, every habitual motion, and every carefully concealed hesitation. Holmes had constructed an invisible web of observation, forcing the criminal to reveal himself through his own meticulous habits. The man took a trembling step backward, glancing at the window. No one could have followed me so closely. I was careful, he muttered, his voice laced with desperation. Holmes' gaze remained unwavering. Carefulness, sir, is a measure of intention, not invisibility. In your effort to maintain control, you followed predictable patterns. Those patterns, when observed and interpreted correctly, disclose everything they conceal. Your cleverness has been matched, and indeed exceeded, by the application of methodical deduction. The intruder's eyes darted toward me, as if seeking sympathy or an ally. And you, doctor? You have seen it all? I nodded, though my understanding of the totality of the deduction could not match Holmes' comprehension. I have seen much, sir, I said cautiously, and the evidence is unambiguous. Your method, your precision, your habitual patterns, every element of your plan has been exposed by observation and deduction. The man's knees seemed to weaken, and he sank slowly onto a chair, the weight of realization pressing down upon him. Holmes took another step closer, his expression calm but commanding. Now we must speak plainly. The terror you have wrought, the illusions you have perpetuated in Whitechapel, are of your own design. There is no vampire, no supernatural force, only careful manipulation, and the reliance upon fear to obscure reality. Yet fear, however potent, cannot withstand scrutiny where logic prevails. For a moment, silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft rustle of papers as the intruder shifted in his seat. Holmes' voice cut through with deliberate precision. Your objective was to create a legend, to control perception through fear, and to elude detection through misdirection. Yet every step you took, every move you rehearsed, every hesitation in execution was a thread leading directly to you. The Whitechapel vampire exists only in the minds you have sought to deceive. The man behind it is now fully revealed. The intruder exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. And all of it undone. By observation, he muttered, almost to himself. Holmes allowed a brief moment to pass before continuing, his tone softening slightly. Not undone, sir, but illuminated. The acts themselves remain, but their purpose, their mystery, and the fear they generated have been reduced to rational understanding. Your design, which relied on terror and uncertainty, has been rendered impotent by careful attention and deductive reasoning. I could see the realization settle upon him. The weight of understanding that every intricate action, every calculated step, had been observed, recorded, and interpreted. Holmes' methodical patience had forced him into a position where concealment was no longer possible, where the meticulous pattern of his movements had become a confession written in space and time. The intruder raised his head slightly, his expression one of reluctant respect. You understand everything, he admitted. Every detail, every sequence. How could anyone see so clearly? Holmes' gaze softened, the faintest glimmer of admiration in his eyes, though tempered by his characteristic detachment. Because, sir, he said, the evidence is always present for those willing to observe with precision, patience, and method. Perception, when coupled with rigorous deduction, reveals even the most cunning design. You have constructed fear with intellect. We have dismantled it with reason. There is no mystery that withstands observation coupled with logic. The intruder leaned back, his shoulders heavy with the realization that his efforts brilliant as they were in conception, had been fully deciphered. Holmes glanced at me, then back to the man, and his voice carried a quiet finality. The next step is straightforward. Scotland Yard, informed by the deductions we have compiled, will ensure that justice is served according to law. Your methods, your manipulations, and your deception have all been documented. There is no escape from consequence where methodical scrutiny prevails. For the first time that evening, the man did not resist. His mask of confidence, so carefully constructed, had crumbled entirely. He nodded faintly, a gesture of resignation and acknowledgement. Holmes, ever precise, had reduced the myth of the Whitechapel vampire to its bare mechanics, a human intellect masquerading as the supernatural. Exposed by unerring observation and the inexorable logic of deduction, as the fog pressed against the windows, and the faint echo of distant footsteps reached the quiet room, I realized that the culmination of our long vigil, the patient tracking, and the careful orchestration of observation had reached its necessary conclusion. The Whitechapel vampire, for all the terror he had inspired, was no more than a man, and the meticulous clarity of Holmes' reasoning had rendered fear powerless. Holmes stood for a moment, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle in the room. "Watson," he said finally, turning toward me, "what is most remarkable is that intellect, no matter how formidable, is never exempt from the consequences of its own pattern. Even in the guise of terror, the evidence endures. And it is through that endurance that truth is revealed." The man, now fully exposed, remained seated, the spell of fear broken, his story unraveled by observation and logic alone. Holmes' patience, precision, and methodical reasoning had transformed what had appeared supernatural into a fully comprehensible narrative, a testament to the enduring power of deduction and the clarity of unyielding scrutiny. Holmes allowed a moment's pause, letting the stillness of the room settle over us like a heavy curtain, before he finally spoke with deliberate calm. "The entire sequence, sir, from your careful manipulations to the atmosphere of dread you cultivated, has been a performance of intellect masquerading as monstrosity. The terror of Whitechapel has been fabricated not by some creature of the night, but by your meticulous attention to method and perception. Every object displaced, every minor adjustment, every hesitation, these have been your confessions. Silent yet undeniable." The man's eyes, now stripped of the arrogance and menace that had cloaked him for weeks, met Holmes with a mixture of astonishment and reluctant respect. All of it, visible to you?" he asked, voice trembling. "I was careful, meticulous. Yet you saw through it?" Holmes' expression remained impassive, yet there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Care and caution may preserve a secret from the casual observer, sir, but the slightest pattern, the most minute deviation, and the unconscious signature of intellect are sufficient for those trained in deduction. Observation, coupled with patient reasoning, renders the elaborate designs of even the cleverest mind transparent." I could see the weight of the revelation pressing upon him. The intricate web of fear he had spun, the panic and rumor that had gripped the East End, were now stripped bare. The supernatural veneer, the whispers of a vampire haunting Whitechapel, dissolved into the stark clarity of methodical human behavior. Holmes' reasoning, precise and unyielding, had dismantled myth with the scalpel of logic. Holmes gestured slightly toward the trunk, where the collection of carefully arranged tools and papers lay. "Here, we see the evidence of your planning. Yet it is also evidence of your pattern, your habitual reliance on repetition and calculation. The very intellect that you trusted to conceal your identity has, through its consistency and precision, revealed it fully." The man slumped back in resignation. "So, there is no vampire, no monster," he murmured, the words tasting of disbelief and dawning understanding. "Only me." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, the monster was never real, only perceived. Fear magnifies, imagination distorts. Yet reason, observation, and deduction are unwavering. They strip away illusion and leave truth in its place. It is not the terror itself, but the meticulous documentation of behavior that reveals character, intent, and identity. As if on cue, footsteps echoed faintly from the street below. Officers whom Holmes had summoned earlier to ensure the man's apprehension arrived at precisely the right moment. The intruder, once a figure cloaked in fear and rumor, was now surrounded not by darkness, but by the certainty of consequence. Holmes' voice, calm and measured, conveyed both authority and finality. "Your story, sir, is concluded. Justice will now proceed according to law. Your attempts to manipulate fear are at an end, for the logic of observation cannot be circumvented." The officers entered, taking in the scene with careful attention, and moved to secure the man. He made no resistance, the weight of revelation having stripped him of the courage or cunning he had so confidently displayed. Holmes, ever meticulous, followed only when necessary, ensuring that the procedural aspect of justice mirrored the precision of deduction. Once the intruder was in custody, Holmes turned toward me, his gaze sweeping the room as though absorbing the full scope of the night's events. "Watson," he said, his voice softened but firm, "it is remarkable how fear can be constructed, and equally remarkable how fragile such constructions become when examined through reason. Even the most elaborate illusions cannot endure the patient, careful application of deduction." I nodded, my mind still attempting to reconcile the terror that had gripped Whitechapel with the rational clarity that now prevailed. "It is extraordinary," I said. "The layers of deception, the fear, the myth entirely undone by observation and logic." Holmes allowed a brief smile, though it was tempered by his usual modesty. "Extraordinary perhaps in appearance, Watson, but inevitable in principle. Patterns reveal themselves to those who watch. Habits betray themselves to those who understand, and intellect cannot hide from intellect. The vampire of Whitechapel is no more than a human mind attempting to play upon superstition, and in doing so, it has exposed itself completely." The fog pressed against the windows outside, muted now, as though the city itself had exhaled in relief. The streets, once alive with rumor and panic, would return to their ordinary rhythm, the tale of the Whitechapel vampire reduced to the mundane truth of human calculation. Holmes, ever ready for the next intellectual challenge, allowed the moment to linger briefly before turning toward the door. "Come, Watson," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of anticipation and indifference. "The night's work is complete, but there will always be another puzzle, another sequence to unravel. For now, the terror has been dispelled, the mystery resolved, and the mind that sought to manipulate fear laid bare. Reason has triumphed, and the city can breathe once more." I followed him, my own sense of relief tempered by admiration, as we descended into the quiet London streets. The gas lamps cast long shadows across the fog-laden pavement, yet beneath their dim light, I understood that the true victory of the evening was not over superstition or rumor, but over the hidden patterns of intellect exposed by observation, logic, and the relentless precision of Sherlock Holmes. Even as the night resumed its calm rhythm, I knew that the memory of the Whitechapel vampire would remain in my mind, not as a creature of the supernatural, but as a testament to the inescapable clarity of deduction, and to the brilliance of a man whose reasoning could render even the most elaborate illusion entirely transparent. Holmes, walking beside me, seemed already poised for the next enigma, his mind sharp and unburdened, ready to confront whatever mystery might emerge from the shadows of London. The case was closed, the villain exposed, and the legend laid bare, but the enduring lesson remained clear. In the realm of intellect, precision, and observation, number deception, however cunningly devised, can escape the unwavering gaze of Sherlock Holmes.